Hey folks, wanted to make a video talking about the Arena Open results and the decks coming out of it that I think are going to have the highest impact on the metagame going forward into the Set Championship Qualifier Weekend this weekend. And this isn't necessarily based on what I think will be the most revolutionary decks going forward in the long run, or even what I think were the decks that statistically had the best results, because in the short term of a metagame that's going to be showing up next weekend, that's not necessarily the important thing. The important thing is, what do people think in the short term, and what has the most impact on that? In my experience, generally speaking, that tends to be Fireshoe's Twitter account. And these are the two lists that I saw showing up the most frequently in Arena Open deck list or results threads. Namely, and I don't necessarily know who actually created these decks. These were the first names I saw retweeting them along with positive results in the event. Namely Frank Karsten's Werewolves deck and Yuki Ichikawa's Izzet Key Control deck. So to take some quick looks at them and to kind of talk about some of the pros and cons and where they fit into the metagame, the red-green Wolves deck is a very aggressive-oriented green deck. It sacrifices a huge amount of the mid-game that even something like mono-green tends to have in order to get on the board really fast against Esper decks and other control decks. But what's interesting about it in particular is the way that it really is trying to build itself around the Esper removal package. There is a very high priority put on creatures that inconvenience Vanishing Verse. Kessig Naturalist, Tovolar, and Halana and Alena being things on curve that aren't monocolored so they don't get exiled. But additionally, Rahilda, that because of a weird design choice that isn't technically a bug, just a very strange design choice, is actually colorless on the reverse side, and so it doesn't get hit by Vanishing Verse, if it's 9. But also, the deck kind of sort of plays around the Parasitic Grasp in a way you wouldn't quite expect, because a lot of the creatures do die to it. But that way is that because Rahilda and Kessig Naturalist turn it to night, or start the day-night cycle going immediately on turn 2, the way that the Esper deck has to sequence its removal can often lead to, if they are on the play and use Parasitic Grasp to kill Rahilda or Kessig Naturalist, they don't usually get to do something on turn 3 at sorcery speed that stops it from flipping to night, which means Reckless Stormseeker, Tovolar, and any of the other werewolf creatures that have two sides then are coming down on their werewolf side that, either in the case of Kessig Naturalist, aren't a human, so they don't die to Parasitic Grasp, or at least Parasitic Grasp doesn't cost less mana, and in the case of Reckless Stormseeker and Tovolar, actually make Reckless Stormseeker not get a discounted cost, but also get out of range of dealing or taking 3 damage and dying. So I think this is a deck that is pretty uniquely positioned to beat up on Esper, and to some extent beat up on other control decks like Izzet, because it does play a lot of low-cost creatures and a lot of things that give haste, and Town-razer Tyrant, which are all cards that are a pretty dense compactment of creatures that control decks don't like dealing with. So where the deck struggles is that compared to a lot of other aggro decks, it's playing no removal in the main, and not really super great removal in the side. It's got like Tangle Traps as a card that it can play against dragons, and Thundering Rebuke as a card it can technically play against green, but none of that really matches up with Blizzard Brawl in terms of answering things and enabling big attacks and allowing you to develop your board in a tempo-y way. In fact, most of these creatures get outstatted by anything that resembles a 4/4 pretty quickly. This isn't a deck that really beats up on other aggro decks, and it super has problems against clerics that tend to make one big flying creature, and this deck just can't handle a big flying creature. It stonewalls absolutely everything this deck is doing. So, to my mind, this deck is in a pretty narrow slot in the metagame, where it is hating on the control decks pretty hard, and it has game against dragons, and it can win against green, but it's not great against it, and just absolutely struggles against clerics. So I do expect that we're probably going to see a fair amount of people playing this next weekend. I don't know if it'll have a lot of staying power in the long run, but for the folks who think that winning this weekend involves beating control decks, this is probably going to be a weapon of choice. I do expect that to mean there's probably going to wind up being slightly more clerics representation as a result, and clerics is probably going to be able to do better as a result as well. I don't know how this deck lines up against the Sanguine Brushstroke decks, and I'll be interested to see that going forward. It does get creatures onto the board relatively quickly that have somewhat decent stats and don't get chump blocked terribly easy by 1/1s. And it has a number of sources of trample, and Town-razer Tyrant flying over does do something, but we'll see. I don't see this deck lining up fantastically against that matchup either. So, on the whole of things, I don't know that I would recommend playing this next weekend, but if the metagame continues to look like it's mostly going to be Esper and Izzet decks, then this is a strong deck, and I expect to see a pretty decent number of players. I would imagine somewhere like 10% of the field playing this deck. So if you are playing Esper, this is absolutely the kind of deck you want to consider orienting your removal package around, and at the very least becoming familiar with the way that the day-night patterns on this deck influence how and when you decide to play your removal out. And the second deck that I see having a major growth in presence by next weekend is Izzet Key Control lists looking something similar to this. This isn't an archetype that I have done a ton of experimenting with. Is it? Yes. Is it with Key? No. And I do think that my initial reluctance to play Key in Esper carried over to me not wanting to play Key in control decks to too much of an extent, because I do actually like the way Key winds up playing out in this Izzet deck. Now, the biggest thing to note about how this whole shell ends up being different from Izzet lists that are heavier on Epiphany and Galvanic Iteration is, well, kind of gave it away. These lists don't seem to run as many Galvanics and Alrund's Epiphany and resemble actual 2-for-1 control decks, or rather 1-for-1 control decks playing multiple draw spells a lot more. And that tends to mean that the deck does things like just use Key to the Archive to ramp into Discover the Formula more than you would expect out of some of the other decks. Now, the reason this deck was likely so successful and so popular is that Unexpected Windfall remains the best way to get ahead in control mirrors, and that hasn't really changed. But the lack of Galvanic Iteration means that the deck can't quite go so over the top as it used to, but Key to the Archive means that you're kind of trying to play control mirrors more fairly than Galvanic Iterationing Discover the Formula or copying Alrund's Epiphanies, and sort of playing Esper's game plan. To that extent, I don't think that it's as good against Esper as lists that are heavier on Galvanic Iteration and Alrund's Epiphany, but that is something you could choose to change. I would probably start by trimming Expressive Iterations and playing maybe 2 Bold Multiverse. If your objective was to try to give yourself the best matchup against other Izzet decks and other Esper decks, which could still very well be the correct decision to make for this coming weekend. I think that's probably where I would lean towards. But the choice to play this many Key to the Archives, I think, is mostly oriented around wanting to have a better matchup against aggro decks. And I do think that it leads to helping Izzet's matchup against aggro decks. I think that this is probably in a better spot than the Izzet deck that I had when it comes to dealing with things like the red-green deck I just talked about. And mostly that's because if you can chain early disruption, like Abrade and Fading Hope and Divide by Zero, into Key to the Archives, it becomes a lot easier to start taking over the game with Hullbreaker Horror and Discover the Formula. And the Izzet decks don't have a lot of tools to recoup the sort of initial card disadvantage they get from Fading Hope and Divide by Zero until they start hitting 6 or 7 mana. So it can be sort of easy when you're not playing Windfall or Key to the Archives on 4 to have this period from 4 to 6 mana where you're kind of starting to have the wheels fall off. You're not just taking the game by storm fast enough, and you probably aren't keeping up with answering all of your opponent's threats as much as you would like. And I think Key to the Archive helps you more reliably jump the gap between those 2 points, which is what Izzet kind of needs to do against aggro decks. The sideboard, I'm not totally sure on. It's very much a mishmash of wanting to have answers to everything at the moment. My gut says that I think cards like Smoldering Egg are probably going to be some of the more impactful things that you can be playing, and I'd probably want to go up to at least 3 as a result. I think that that's probably a good spot to be against Gruul. The games that I played tonight on stream seem to indicate that Smoldering Egg coming down early was the thing that Gruul struggled the most against, because once it flipped into Ashmouth Dragon, if there wasn't an answer for that, the removal aspect of Ashmouth Dragon started to allow Izzet to recoup card advantage without necessarily tapping out for it with something like Discover the Formula, and therefore there weren't really openings to resolve hasty creatures. If Clerics winds up being a major deck, and I don't expect it to be a majorly represented deck in terms of play, but I do think that if the metagame moves towards decks that are hostile to Esper, then Clerics could be a good choice against a lot of the ways that I see people doing that. Then I think this deck probably wants to play another Hullbreaker Horror as well. Burn Down the House, not really an effective board wipe against Clerics, though Fading Hope and Divide by Zeros are nice against that deck because they tend to go pretty tall on one creature. But Hullbreaker Horror was the card that in my experience has most flipped matches for Izzet around in games against Clerics, because it tends to be that the repeated bounce effect is the sort of card advantage that they can't handle. And it's not quite card advantage in the typical sense, but they invest a lot of resources into growing each individual creature, and Hullbreaker Horror tends to reset those creatures a lot rapidly and more reliably than trying to find a bunch of Fading Hopes and Leers to recur them, which this deck is only playing 1 Leer, so you can't actually have that be a reliable plan. And although it is playing a lot of Discover the Formulas and a lot of expressive iterations to try to get 2-for-1s, you still gotta actually be answering the opponent's threats while you're doing that. And to me, Hullbreaker Horror seems like it does that better than Cyclone Summoner, at the very least. Some of the other stuff, I'm not actually sure what it's supposed to come in against, like Goldspan or Vadrik. And my concerns about Izzet not having super great tools to fight Blood Artist decks and the reach that they represent are still present here. I tried to change to having black mana to answer that. Maybe it turns out that Key to the Archives finding stuff like Approach of the Second Sun and Time Warp can counteract that enough. That's something I kind of want to take this deck for a spin and experiment with to see how much that offsets it. But overall, I would say I expect this and shells similar to it to probably be the decks that have the most increased representation from last weekend to the upcoming Set Championship Weekend. So not necessarily to the same extent as Esper. I would still expect that Esper is probably going to be the most popular deck, although less so than it was at the Arena Open. I would say that this is probably a deck you want to make sure you have a game plan for. And if I was playing Esper, how would you account for this? I don't really know how Esper takes this matchup and makes it into something excellent, because with it not leaning on Galvanic Iteration nearly as hard, it doesn't really fold as easily to something like Test of Talents. I don't know. That's going to have to be something that I work on, but I don't see an easy way out for Esper to make this matchup good, which is probably a very good thing for the deck. I think this is a deck that, at least with some sideboard changes, I would pretty strongly consider playing for the event, personally. If the brushstroke matchups are decent with Key to the Archive, possibly even without it, because I think that your matchups against everything else probably are pretty solid, especially with more Smoldering Eggs, then yeah, I think this is a very, very good spot to start. So to take a look at how I expect the rise of green-red and Izzet Control to impact the matchups of the various decks that we ranked last week, Esper Control I think is definitely a weaker deck now, in that it was very much the deck that people were coming in with a plan to attack, and now there's going to be more of the metagame that's adapted to those plans to attack Esper. What Esper winds up doing to account for that, I don't really yet know. Like I said, I don't think that there's a super great way that it can try to attack Izzet Control. I think it's probably just going to be a underdog there pretty much no matter what. More so, Esper kind of gains from potentially other decks showing up that are weaker to Esper's removal, and I expect that the biggest change that it can make is in regards to how its removal package lines up against green-red aggro. The brushstroke decks, I expect, are probably going to be relatively unaffected. I'm not entirely sure how the Izzet deck performs against them relative to Esper or relative to the other Izzet Control decks, the ones that were running more copies of Epiphany and fewer copies of Key to the Archive. That, I think, is going to be something that I'll need to do a little bit more testing of. Probably going to do that tomorrow. Or Wednesday night, rather. So not long after this video goes live, if you want to check that out. But I also haven't seen as many people playing Sanguine Brushstroke decks on the ladder. I know the ones that did tend to do well over the weekend seemed to be either the ones that were hard into white-black mid-range, trying to attack creature decks mostly, and the ones that were deep into black-red aggro with more of an orientation around beating control decks. I expect if Izzet Control tends to pick up more play, it will probably be the black-red versions of the deck that are more oriented towards beating that. I do not expect that the white-black mid-range decks will have as much luck against Izzet as they do against Esper, and I don't know that I'm actually convinced they are super great against Esper to begin with. So I don't think that'd be where I would go, but I'm also not a mid-range player, generally speaking. So I don't pretend to know their minds as much. Izzet Epiphany, meanwhile, I was experimenting with splashing into black for more ability to shore up the aggro matchups, and maybe that has some merit against green-red specifically. Parasitic Grasp is still a pretty decent removal spell against them, especially when copied, but I would expect that Izzet Key Control probably overtakes Izzet Epiphany in general on the whole of the metagame right now. And yeah, I've mentioned this a few times, but we're going to see how that fares against aggro. I suspect a lot of the representation this past weekend was driven by good control matchups. We'll see if that holds true if green-red especially picks up more representation. Mono green, I didn't think was well positioned by the time the weekend came around. The matchup against Esper just wasn't good enough, and that did tend to be the most represented deck. I do think it actually stands to benefit from these changes, though, because Izzet is not terribly well positioned against mono green. In the versions that are currently going around are lighter on Fading Hope, lighter on Leer, and lighter on Eggs, which are all cards that were more important to how it fought mono green. And green-red aggro is a deck that is definitely behind in the matchup against mono green, because mono green's creatures are just much more well-statted, and the removal is much more effective. So, although I don't think mono green is good as long as Esper is the top deck to beat, I do think that most of the metagame shifts here probably benefit it. Blue-white control, I expect probably still is just not as good of a choice as Esper. It doesn't really have too much to gain, and I think that its reliance on better sorcery speed board wipes than Esper control probably leaves it even less well positioned against green-red aggro than Esper is. The unconditional removal that it has is more unconditional against monocolored creatures, but Parasitic Grasp is still a good card, even when green-red does as much as it can to play around it, and blue-white doesn't really make up for that. And again, green-red, lots of sources of haste. Blue-white hates to see that because it's not playing instant speed removal. Green-red aggro didn't necessarily get any better or worse. Maybe Izzet ends up making it slightly better if there's less Esper around. I think green-red is probably still more favored against Izzet than it is against Esper, even if it is favored against Esper. But I don't think that it improves in the sense that more decks are going to be targeting it now, to some extent, even if that's just being conscientious with their removal spell to a new degree, because more players will be aware of the day-night interactions and how that affects timing, or because the removal spells they choose to play tend to be slightly more considerate of green-red. I do think that Clerics has a chance to increase in representation, not necessarily because of any particular deck getting preyed on by it, but it was an okay choice to begin with, and Esper was the worst matchup in all likelihood. So more players may feel confident playing Clerics because green-red is a very good matchup for it, and Izzet isn't a bad matchup for it. Or not a terrible matchup anyway. I think if Izzet is built properly with more copies of Hullbreaker, properly for the matchup, I should say, then Clerics is probably an underdog there, but we'll see. Blue-black control, I experimented with, and ultimately I don't think I'm as happy with as this second rank would indicate. It could get to the spot where it was slightly favored against Esper, but nowhere near as much as Izzet, and still has pretty much all the same weaknesses as Esper, other than that its removal can be less sniped than Vanishing Verse, but playing removal that costs you 2 life to cast still kind of miserable. Mono white, I think, is still basically non-existent. It doesn't really have great matchups and still folds to decks that run Meathook Massacre. I think mono white is probably well positioned against Izzet, which likely improves its positioning a tiny bit, but still not great against everything with Meathook Massacre, and that's not a great spot to be. Clerics, that's probably, as I said, one of the less clear decks. It definitely goes up in ranking because it gets a lot more decks to prey on now, and I could see a lot of players deciding to run versions of Izzet that don't adequately respect Clerics. So we will see. I think that it definitely goes up into tier 2 at the very least. I don't know precisely what exactly that difference means, but relative to where it was last weekend, I see it being more well-positioned now. And Dragons continues to be a deck that I would not recommend. I did not see much in the way of anyone talking about winning with it on day 2. I expect a limited entry event like the Arena Open to have a lot less representation for Dragons, because I think you're going to see a lot fewer players who just decide on a whim to play whatever they were playing on the ladder, which I think was a big portion of Dragons representation in day 1. And the deck continues to feel like it is just not reliable enough to make up for the times where it doesn't get the nut draw, and the nut draw loses too often to make up for the times where it's not reliable. And Izzet Mill, I have not seen any representation in best of 3. I think that it probably just folds too hard to the sideboard packages in Control. Test of Talents especially is a card that I don't think Izzet Mill is particularly well equipped to deal with. So maybe there's a future there, but I would not expect it to show up anytime in the next week, and certainly not in large numbers. So I think that's basically where everything has changed to now. And if there are any decks you think did well over the weekend, or that you expect to increase in representation, let me know in the comments. I am interested. I'm obviously not omniscient, and there's a lot of stuff getting coverage out there that I miss. But I would say the most important thing to note isn't necessarily if a deck is good. The most important thing to consider when evaluating metagame shifts is if a deck is loudly and on social media being prominent and good. Because it only makes a shift in the metagame if people actually are aware of it. So with that said, let me know.